In the aftermath of the First World War, mankind danced to a brand new tune. In Berlin, in London, as far afield as here in Shanghai, city dwellers were spellbound by an American dream. The United States stood for new freedoms in economic, social and political life. Nothing captured that new freedom better than jazz. A music born in the segregated world of black Americans, but now repackaged as mood music for a global party. But the American dream was shattered by the greatest economic disaster in modern history. All over the world, the Great Depression wrecked both capitalism and democracy. The planned economy took the place of the free market. Racial assimilation gave way to racial persecution. Now people weren't dancing, they were marching to war. The path from depression to war was a long and winding road. We tend to assume that it was Germany that unleashed that war, and that therefore to explain the rise of Hitler is to explain the origins of the war. But Hitler was a relative latecomer to the War of the World. For the Second World War didn't begin in Poland in 1939. It began in 1937, right here in China.
And handsome 1920s brought undreamed-of prosperity. The then Secretary of Labor declared,
"The material progress of America is one of the most astonishing things recorded in the annals of nations. Our wealth is 40% of the entire wealth of the earth."
In the 1920s, the world economy bounced back after the upheaval of the First World War. The forces of globalization revived. Trade, international investment, migration, all returned to their pre-war levels. In this environment, it was easy to export the American model. Mass production, mass consumption, mass democracy. But this was just a brief and deceptive interlude of prosperity in the 100 Years' War of the 20th century. And it all came to a juddering halt on October the 28th, 1929, when the Wall Street crash wiped 89% of the volume of the US stock market. With the benefit of hindsight, the crisis was inevitable. Overcapacity in agriculture and heavy industry, the financial burdens left over by the war. These problems were compounded by governments raising tariffs and taxes. World trade simply collapsed. The effects on ordinary people were calamitous.
within the year, 3 million Americans are ex-wage earners, unemployed. Millions of Americans, men, women, and children, wait in the cold, on bread lines, in soup kitchens.
In Germany, it was much the same story. In parts of Japan, people starved. Both capitalism and democracy seem to have failed. By crippling the American colossus, the Depression not only revealed the limits of the American way, it also sent a shockwave through any economy that traded with the United States or had borrowed American money.
Stop thinking and follow me, cried Hitler. I will make you masters of the world. And the people answered, Heil! Heil!
In some countries, people concluded that the only way out of this crisis was a new kind of government, one that would wield total control over the economy, one that would deal with the internal enemies they held responsible for their plight.
Stop thinking and follow your God Emperor, cried the Japanese warlords, and Japan will rule the world. And the people answered, Banzai, Banzai!
Yet one country appeared to have seen the crisis coming and to have avoided it by constructing an alternative model of economic organisation. The Americans had left things to the market. The Russians, by contrast, had a plan. The more the American dream turned to nightmare, the more people were attracted to this new model of a planned economy. Insulated from the vagaries of the market, yet capable of feats of construction every bit as awesome as the skyscrapers of New York. This canal, with its 11 massive locks, was built to link Moscow with the Volga River 70 miles away. As a centrepiece of Stalin's first 5-year plan, it symbolized the apparently realizable dream of state socialism. And visitors from the West reacted ecstatically. In 1931, the Irish writer and socialist George Bernard Shaw was brought here to witness the building of a workers' paradise. As an invited guest of the Soviet regime, Shaw appeared to leave his customary cynicism at the border.
Stalin has delivered the goods to an extent that seemed impossible 10 years ago, and I take my hat off to him accordingly.
The construction of the Moscow-Volga Canal was just one example of what Joseph Stalin called socialism in one country. His plan for the industrialization of Russia's backward rural economy without the need for a worldwide revolution. It was a proposition that sparked furious debate within the Soviet intelligentsia. Stalin rode roughshod over these intellectual arguments. Rapid industrialization within the borders of the Soviet Union was perfectly possible, he argued. All you needed was willpower and a plan. Stalin's vision of socialism in one country implied a new economic revolution, one that he, the self-styled man of steel, would lead. How precisely it was to be done was something Stalin's star-struck Western admirers preferred to ignore, and something Stalin himself was careful to hide. This canal was built by literally thousands of convicts, tiny cogs in a giant engine that ran on slave labor. Behind the seeming miracles of the planned economy lay the giant network of prisons and camps, known simply as the Gulag. This is the building in the Russian state archives that houses the once secret files of the Gulag. Now, the camps had originated as improvised prisons for political opponents of the regime. But then in the 1930s, one of Stalin's lieutenants realized that instead of just freezing or starving the prisoners to death, they could be put to work. After all, what could the so-called Zeki refuse to do? So pretty soon, there were camps for coal mining, camps for gold mining, camps for road building, camps even for nuclear physics. Camps, in short, for just about everything. The key thing was to keep this system fueled with new slaves, and by defining virtually any dissent as treason, that the Stalinist system was well able to do. And here are just a few of the victims of the Gulag. It's rather haunting
to look at these faces. This particular old lady, Berna Klauda, was sentenced to 10 years in the Perm Gulag for expressing anti-government sentiments.
Between January 1935 and June 1941, there were just under 20 million arrests and 7 million executions, many of them in St. Petersburg. The bodies of tens of thousands of people were brought here to this mosquito-infested forest just outside the city and secretly buried. Their whereabouts remained unknown, a state secret, until 1989. But the extermination of class enemies in their millions turned out to be only one part of Stalin's murderous plan. In Stalin's Soviet Union, economic planning meant class war. A new proletariat was to arise amid the smokestacks, while the collectivization of agriculture was to liquidate the better-off peasants known as kulaks. But that wasn't the whole story. The Moscow-Volga Canal offers another clue to Stalin's motives for mass murder. It was built not just by political prisoners, but by Tatars and Georgians forcibly transported over 1,000 miles from their homelands. Many of their bodies were mixed into the concrete supports of these locks as ballast. For Stalin was a proponent not just of class war, he was also a pioneer of ethnic cleansing. We tend to think of class and race as distinct concepts, but in Stalin's Soviet Union, the distinctions were never so clear-cut. For one thing, under Stalin, class itself became a hereditary attribute. If your father was a worker, then you were a worker too. If your father was a kulak, then woe betide you. Secondly, and crucially, Stalin came to regard certain ethnic groups in what was still a multinational empire as inherently unreliable. Stalin's racial policy was uncovered by a young Scottish adventurer named Fitzroy MacLean, a junior official in the British Embassy in Moscow. Determined to gather intelligence on what was happening outside the capital, MacLean ignored the regime's travel restrictions and hopped aboard the Trans-Siberian Railway. At Altaisk station, he noticed a number of cattle trucks being hitched onto his train.
These were filled with people who turned out to be Koreans, who with their families and belongings were on their way from the Far East to Central Asia, where they were being sent to work on the cotton plantations. They had no idea why they were being deported. Later, I heard that the Soviet authorities quite arbitrarily removed some 200,000 Koreans.
What MacLean had witnessed was just one episode in a vast program of deportation. And here's the confirmation of MacLean's story. A top-secret letter from Yezhov, the head of the NKVD, confirming that 171,781 Koreans had been transported by train from the Far East to Uzbekistan. And this document's interesting too because it breaks down the entire population of the Gulag in 1939 by nationality. For example, you've got 15,039 Poles registered as being in the camps. Actually, Poles were particularly targeted for persecution under the Stalin regime. There's even a document here in the State Archives with the wonderful, straightforward line, Raz Polyak значит kulak, which means simply, if it's a Pole, then it's a kulak. In Stalin's Russia, racial persecution was often disguised as class warfare. Balkars, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Germans, Greeks, Ingushi, Meskhetians, Kalmyks, Karachai, Poles and Ukrainians. Throughout Stalin's reign, more than 1.5 million members of these and other ethnic minorities died as a result of forcible resettlement, a policy that had nothing to do with the Marxism-Leninism Stalin professed, and everything to do with his deep suspicion of all non-Russians. On close inspection then, socialism in one country turned out to be a lot like what was evolving in Germany, National Socialism. Nevertheless, most Western observers preferred to play down the similarities between the two totalitarian regimes. Indeed, they tended to assume that they were sworn ideological enemies. In truth, the two were already in the process of merging. The result would be a new and lethal kind of imperialism based on ruthless economic exploitation and racial subjugation. At first sight, Germany in the 1920s looked like the America of Europe. Big, industrial, federal, ultra-modern. It had huge corporations like Siemens, Mercedes-Benz and Deutsche Bank. But behind the cosmopolitan veneer of cities like Berlin, there was another Germany. A Germany of small towns, like Adolf Hitler's favourite holiday destination, Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, which felt no affection for the frenzied modernism of the Großstadt, the big city. Even today, places like Berchtesgaden still purvey the same kind of kitschy, folksy version of German culture. It looks pretty harmless, the kind of thing you might encounter in tourist traps anywhere. And yet, when Germans in the 1920s and 1930s spoke of themselves as a folk, they meant something altogether more muscular and more sinister than when bearded Englishmen talked about folk music. Of course, the English-speaking world had its small towns too, which were also rocked by the Depression. The question is, why in Germany and not in the United States? An economic shock led to the overthrow of both democracy and the rule of law. The simple answer is that whereas the American political system produced Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, Germany's produced Hitler. Like Roosevelt, Hitler offered economic recovery. But that was not all. He was to be the redeemer who ended years of national humiliation after Germany's defeat in the war. Economic recovery was to be the prelude to the acquisition of living space beyond Germany's borders. The millions of German speakers outside the Reich were to be brought home to a greater Germany.
Sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
The popular response elicited by Hitler's program for national salvation was quasi-religious in its fervour. In reality, Hitler was much more of a mobster than a messiah. Indeed, the Nazis were rather like 1920s Chicago gangsters, beating up or gunning down their rivals. The difference was that in the United States, the mafia never actually took over the government, nor did Al Capone ever put out a contract on an entire race. From his earliest days as a right-wing demagogue, Hitler had made no secret of his hatred for the Jews.
Wir erkennen, dass hier ein Pestherd liegt.
Once they were in power, the Nazis strove to portray the Jews as an alien element in German society, as in the propaganda film The Eternal Jew.
Ist der plastische Dämon des Verfalls der Menschheit.
Unlike in some other European countries, the overwhelming majority of German Jews were wholly and happily assimilated into the middle classes. A key symptom of this integration was the rise in the rate of intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews in Germany. In Hamburg, by the early 1930s, 1 in every 2 marriages involving a Jew was a mixed marriage. Many leaders of the German Jewish community feared that if these trends continued, Judaism in Germany would simply die out. One of the great puzzles of the 20th century is why the most extreme racial violence in all history arose in a society where assimilation was exceptionally far advanced. Hitler's determination to exclude the Jews from what he called the ethnic community, the Volksgemeinschaft, meant identifying and persecuting a minority that was inextricably woven into German society. And perhaps that was the crucial point. Perhaps the Nazis' anti-Semitism was a kind of backlash against the very success of Jewish assimilation. Maybe Hitler was articulating a popular anxiety that what was happening in cities like Berlin posed a fundamental threat to the folksy German culture of small towns like Berchtesgaden. A perfect example of German Jewish assimilation was Victor Klemperer. The son of an East Brandenburg rabbi, Klemperer, like Hitler, had served in the Bavarian army during the First World War. Later, he became a professor here in Dresden. In 1906, he had married Eva Schlemmer, a Protestant. Klemperer himself had converted to Christianity. But conversion couldn't protect him from the virulent racism that swept through Germany in the 1930s. Klemperer kept a detailed diary of how his loss of civil liberties turned him into an alien in his own homeland. No document provides a better insight into what it felt like to be on the receiving end of National Socialism.
August the 11th, 1935. The Jew baiting has become so extreme that we expect to be beaten to death at any moment. I simply cannot believe that the mood of the masses is really still behind Hitler. But everyone, literally everyone, cringes with fear. No letter, no telephone conversation, no word on the street is safe anymore.
Around 200 Jewish academics left Germany in 1933, including 20 Nobel laureates, among them Albert Einstein. But Klemperer, who was professor of Romance languages here at the Dresden Technical University, decided to stay. In 1935, he was fired.
And every day the Hitler government is more firmly established internationally and therefore more secure at home. These must be the saddest days of my life.
Then, just a few months later, Klemperer was barred from the university library on his birthday. The authorities proceeded to confiscate his sabre, a souvenir of his military service, his typewriter, his telephone, and finally, his car. Yet it was the legal fact of his marriage to an Aryan that most exercised the Nazis. In Mein Kampf, Hitler had indulged in one of those classic sexual fantasies which lurked at the root of Nazi anti-Semitism.
With satanic joy in his face, the black-haired Jewish youth lurks in wait for the unsuspecting girl whom he defiles with his blood, thus stealing her from her people.
The key point is that when Hitler spoke of the Jews trying to pollute the blood of the Aryan race, what he had in mind was precisely the upsurge in mixed marriages that was going on in the 1920s. And he was by no means the only one. One of the best-selling books of 1920 was this one, Arthur Dinter's Sin Against the Blood. It tells the story of a young woman whose blood turns out to have been fatally polluted because of her Jewish father. Her husband Hermann Kempfer only finds this out with the birth of their unmistakably Jewish-looking sons. And then when he tries marrying another apparently pure-blooded German woman, the same thing happens, simply because she had once slept with a Jewish man.
17th of September 1935. While I was writing yesterday, the Reichstag in Nuremberg had already passed the laws on German blood and German honour, prohibition for marriage and extramarital intercourse between Jews and Germans.
The Nuremberg laws were by no means unique. There were laws against interracial marriage and sex in the southern states of the United States and in South Africa, where, of course, racial differences were a great deal more visible than they were in 1930s Germany. But for the Nazis, it was just a first step to stop Jews from having sex with non-Jews. The next thing they had to figure out was how to get the right sort of Aryans to breed in the right sort of way. The Reich Agriculture Minister, Walter Darré, was convinced the answer could be found down on the farm.
Just as we breed our Hanoverian horses using a few pure stallions and mares, so we will once again breed pure Nordic Germans.
This nice little volume is the Handbook for the German Family, published in the early 1930s as a kind of guide to newlyweds or potential newlyweds. It's full of all kinds of useful tips, recipes, advice on housekeeping, and also these invaluable 10 rules for the choice of your spouse. Number 1 is remember that you are a German. Number 3 is keep your body pure. Number 5 is marry only someone who is of German or comparably Nordic blood. And number 6 is don't forget to ask about your potential spouse's ancestors. If all of the various criteria are met, then you can go on straight to number 10 and have as many children as possible. Another way of bolstering the numbers of the German folk was this, the German Mother's Medal. This was doled out to women who overfulfilled their quotas of Nordic sprogs. In a grotesque kind of childbearing Olympics, there were gold medals, silver medals and bronze medals. Needless to say, Jewish women weren't eligible. How on earth did a man like Victor Klemperer fail to see the approaching calamity? Why did the Jews of Germany, and indeed of Europe, not flee sooner to avoid the fate that lay in store for them? The answer is that many did. Yet to thoroughly German-minded Jews like Klemperer, emigration amounted to giving in to the Nazis.
The solution to the Jewish question can only be found in the deliverance from those who invented it. And the world, because now this really does concern the world, will be forced to act accordingly. But the world showed little sign of acting to help the German Jews. On the contrary, in 1936, the British announced a ban on further Jewish immigration to Palestine for fear of an Arab backlash. Not for the last time in the 1930s, British politicians found themselves defending the indefensible. The stability of the British Empire came first, and the biggest threat to that stability came not from Germany, but from much further east. In December 1926, Crown Prince Hirohito succeeded his father Emperor Yoshihito to the throne of Japan. He was formally declared a living god in accordance with the Japanese state religion of Shinto. One of the most important Shinto shrines is Yasukuni here in Tokyo. Founded in 1869 by the Emperor Meiji, Hirohito's grandfather, it houses the souls of all those who've laid down their lives in battle for Japan. But no new souls were supposed to come here during Hirohito's reign. Ironically, it was to be the Showa era, the age of illustrious peace. But 3 years after Hirohito's succession, the Great Depression struck. Civilian politicians yielded power to the emperor and his military commanders.
Young men were drafted into the armed forces, where they were indoctrinated with the spirit of Bushido, the martial ethos of the samurai warrior. The first lesson a new recruit learned was the soldier's code, the 7 duties of the emperor's servant in arms. These were loyalty, unconditional obedience to orders, courage, the controlled use of force, frugality, respect for one's seniors, and above all, honor. Together, the cult of the emperor and the samurai code of Bushido created a potent nationalism which portrayed Japan as the last bastion of virtue in a corrupt world. Other countries responded to the Depression by embracing National Socialism. The Japanese answer was imperial militarism. And Japan's generals were agreed on one thing. In the dire economic conditions of the 1930s, Japan's empire had to expand or die. New territory would provide the raw materials Japan's arms industry desperately needed. In turn, military expenditure would stimulate the country's languishing economy. But this would not be an empire like the loose, multicultural empires of the past. It would be a new empire state based on centralized control and racial subjugation. Its launchpad would be the northeastern Chinese province of Manchuria. Since defeating Russia in 1905, Japan had run the principal railway line in southern Manchuria. In September 1931, the Japanese army deliberately blew up a short stretch of the line here at Shenyang. This became known as the Manchurian Incident. It was a pivotal moment in the War of the World. Cynically blaming the explosion on Chinese bandits, the Japanese claimed the province was descending into anarchy. They used this as a pretext to occupy not only Shenyang, but in the space of a few weeks, nearly the whole of Manchuria. By the mid-1930s, Manchuria had been transformed into the Japanese satellite state of Manchukuo. Shenyang began to look increasingly like a Japanese city. Witness the distinctly fascistic-looking city hall that still stands here today. In theory, it made perfectly good sense for European imperial dominance of Asia to be replaced by Japanese. After all, the Japanese ought to have known better how to run a place like Manchuria than Europeans. And in fairness, they did a pretty good job of developing their new colony. Yet for all their talk of Asian co-prosperity, it quickly became apparent that the Japanese had an even lower opinion of their fellow Asians than Europeans did. To be blunt, they regarded the Chinese as their racial inferiors. If Europe was to be replaced by Japan in Asia, it certainly wouldn't be through kindness to the natives. 200 miles to the south in Dalian, the locals still learn Japanese. Today it's a matter of choice. But in the 1930s, the Chinese were forced to learn Japanese as their first language. They were made to worship the Emperor Hirohito at Shinto shrines and had to bow whenever they saw a Japanese soldier, or else risk a beating. This was a Japanese colony. In fact, it was run as if it were part of the Japanese mainland. Even today, it still has a distinctly Japanese feel to it. You hear Japanese spoken, and Japanese firms come here to invest. The whole city's laid out on a Japanese plan. It's really quite unlike anywhere else I've seen in China. Walking around here, you get a sense of how China might have looked if Japan had achieved her objectives in World War II. For a time, those objectives seemed far from unrealistic. The Japanese knew that no one was prepared to back the Chinese up with anything more than fine words. When the League of Nations called on the Japanese to withdraw their troops from Manchuria, the Japanese responded by withdrawing from the League. Each year between 1931 and 1937, the Japanese advanced virtually unopposed deeper and deeper into Chinese territory. The world just watched. By July 1937, the Japanese had reached the outskirts of Beijing. It was time to manufacture yet another incident. When did the Second World War begin? Well, the usual answer is September 1939, when the Germans and their Soviet confederates overran Poland. But that's a very European answer to the question. The real answer is July 1937, when full-scale war broke out between Japan and China. And it happened right here at Lukachau, just outside Beijing, known in the West as the Marco Polo Bridge. At dawn on July the 7th, a Japanese soldier got lost on the outskirts of the city. He was actually having a quick pee. But the Japanese Imperial Army claimed he'd been kidnapped and used this as a pretext to overrun the nearby suburbs. Finally, the moment had come for the Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, to fight back. Suddenly, what had started as an incident had become a full-blown war. In August 1937, Japanese Marines attempted to drive the Chinese out of the international port of Shanghai. Now there could be absolutely no doubt about it. Japan was intent on conquering most, if not all, of China. And the aim was very clearly to create an empire that would exploit China's vast resources for the exclusive benefit of Japan. Bombs and shells rained down on what had once been the Orient's most swinging city. The War of the World had come to Asia. For a month, Shanghai held out, a cage for its several million inhabitants. Yet in their luxurious villas and the city's international enclaves, Shanghai's Western inhabitants acted as if the war had nothing to do with them. Why was it that the Western democracies were so ready to tolerate Japanese aggression, even when it devastated what was supposed to be an international city? The British were especially desperate to avoid war with the Japanese. Defending the key British ports at Hong Kong and Singapore would mean deploying ships that might be needed in waters closer to home. And war was costly. Too costly, surely, for a country still reeling from the Depression. So rather than contemplate the ghastly prospect of a combined German, Italian, Japanese assault on their vast imperium, the British elected to adopt the policy of Dickens's Mr. Micawber. Oppressed by the thought of their own vast debts, they hoped against hope that something, anything, would turn up. After all, rapid rearmament might jeopardize their already fragile economic recovery. In other words, just as the Depression convinced the Japanese that they should seek overseas conquest, so it persuaded the British that they could do nothing to resist it. For obvious reasons, we tend to think of the 1930s in terms of the origins of the Second World War. The question we tend to ask is whether or not the Western powers could have done more to avert it, whether or not the policy of appeasing Japan and Germany was a fatal blunder that led to war. But this may be to reverse the order of events. Appeasement didn't lead to war. It was war the numerous acts of aggression that swept the world in the 1930s that led to appeasement.
4 years after the Japanese invaded China, Mussolini sent troops into Ethiopia. A year later, Hitler marched into the Rhineland. In 1937, his bombers flattened the Spanish town of Guernica. In 1938, the Nazis annexed Austria. The Western democracies, still struggling to recover from the Depression, were desperate to avoid confrontation with these aggressive new empire states.
Appeasement wasn't about preserving peace. It was about limiting war. After all, what did the dictators want? The British had never really believed in the Treaty of Versailles, which had redrawn the boundaries of Europe after the war. And in any case, Hitler kept protesting his desire for peaceful coexistence with the British Empire. But these superficially rational arguments for appeasement were reinforced by some distinctly irrational prejudices.
The fact of the matter is that there was no shortage of people within the British establishment who sympathised with aspects of Hitler's policy, even his anti-Semitism. Lord Londonderry, Secretary of State for Air in the early 30s, was so keen on Hitler that he wrote an entire book defending the Nazi regime, including even its persecution of the Jews.
I have no great affection for the Jews. It is possible to trace their participation in most of those international disturbances which have created so much havoc in different countries.
To grasp why the British establishment fundamentally underestimated the danger that Hitler represented, you only need to spend a little time here in Oxford. It was at All Souls College that some of the most influential proponents of appeasement liked to convene. Amongst their number was the editor of the Times, Geoffrey Dawson, who'd previously been the college's bursar and had the ear of the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain.
I'm sitting here in Dawson's study at All Souls, looking at one of his editions of the Times, which contains an article by Lord Lothian, another eminent aristocratic proponent of appeasement. Lothian writes, Herr Hitler has said explicitly to me, as he has also said publicly, that what Germany wants is equality, not war. And here's Lothian's payoff line: we are far more likely to interest Germany in the problem of European peace by treating her as a friend and a member of the European community.
On the 10th of March 1938, Dawson attended the German ambassador Joachim von Ribbentrop's farewell reception in London. The next day, German troops marched into Austria. At this point, another fellow of All Souls, the historian Isaiah Berlin, started to feel something more like the damp chill of defeatism from Dawson and his colleagues.
They didn't talk about appeasement in front of us, but they did in the privacy of their own rooms. They were fundamentally racist. They weren't anti-Semitic in any overt sense, but they believed in the Aryan ascendancy. Germany, Scandinavia, the White Empire, you see. The defense of what might be called white Western values against the horrors of the East.
Berlin's remarks seem pretty damning now. But it's easy to forget that at the time, appeasement was a popular policy. Chamberlain was hailed as a heroic peacemaker when he returned from Munich in September 1938. In fact, all he'd done was to hand the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia to Hitler in return for a promise of peace. Six months later, Hitler reneged on his word and marched on Prague. Czechoslovakia simply ceased to exist. This wasn't peace. It was just conquest without shooting.
In the old days, it would have been a relatively simple matter to have checked Hitler's territorial ambitions. All you'd have needed would have been the 1914 combination of Britain, France and Russia. Indeed, if such an alliance had acted decisively to defend Czechoslovakia in 1938, Hitler might even have been overthrown by his own military. But it was not to be.
If Chamberlain had called Hitler's bluff over Czechoslovakia, the costs of standing up to the Nazis would have been much lower than they were a year later. So why did he not do as Churchill urged and strike a bargain with the Russians?
Of all the arguments for appeasement, perhaps the best was this, that even as late as 1939, Hitler had still done nothing to compare with the campaign of violence unleashed by Stalin against the peoples of the Soviet Union. Sure, the likes of Dawson turned one blind eye to the realities of Nazi rule, but many more people on the British left shut both eyes to the horrors of Stalinism, and they took much longer to open their eyes.
The one thing people in England took for granted was that communism and fascism were irreconcilable foes. Appeasement was just a convenient way of not choosing between them for people on both sides of the political spectrum. Yet this was to overlook how much behind the labels of communist and fascist the totalitarian regimes of the 1930s had in common. All were committed to the model of a planned economy as an alternative to the free market. All aspired to exert control over every aspect of their people's lives. All had contempt for supposedly inferior races.
There was just one important difference. Stalin already had an empire. The Japanese were well on the way to acquiring one. But in 1939, Hitler's career as a conqueror had only just begun. Against a wiser prime minister, that career might have come to a humiliating and premature end over Czechoslovakia. But in many ways, appeasement saved Hitler from himself. Now, to make sure that his next move was less risky, he did the one thing the appeasers had never expected. He made common cause with his supposed ideological arch-enemy, Stalin. The time for economic plans was over. Now Hitler and Stalin had to follow the Japanese lead and start making war plans. The phony peace of appeasement was at an end.